So this week's sessions, we're going to concentrate on business level strategy. And in this first short screencast, I just want to introduce you to the concept of what business level strategy is before we go on in subsequent screencasts and look at how organisations actually decide on a business level strategy and then pursue that strategy. So before we do that, let's just reorientate ourselves within the strategic management process. So following last week's lecture, and I also appreciate that this is ongoing work for you and that we're going to continue looking at this in this week's seminar and next week's seminar. We through what we've covered so far, we ought to be able to assess the organisation's strategic position, which is made up of an analysis of the environment to identify the major forces in the environment, both the macro environment through PESTEL and the micro or industry environment through Porter's 5 forces. And from this we derive the opportunities and threats which confront the organisation. What we looked at last week is trying to understand what the organisation is currently capable of and not capable of. And we did this through internal analysis. So you will currently be working on and will continue working on in the coming weeks your internal analysis templates, whether that's a form of functional analysis or a value chain analysis. But what you're doing there is you are identifying the resources and the competencies that the organisation has in its various functions or its various activities. And the outcome of this is you get a good handle on the strengths and weaknesses that the organisation has. And the strategic position also needs to take account of expectations and purposes. So the purpose of the organisation, its mission, its goals, and the expectations of stakeholders. So the organisations who have an interest in the operations and the performance of the organisation. So the strategic, once we've covered these things, we're in a position then, or a place where we're able to say, where are we now? Okay, so what is the current strategic position? Where are we now in terms of the strengths and weaknesses that the organisation has and the opportunities and threats that it's confronted with, and how do its strengths and weaknesses match with the opportunities and threats? So that is where we are now. And some of this is tempered by where do we want to be. We also need to have a view of where we want to be at this stage before we move on to the next stage in the strategic management process, which is thinking about strategic choices. And when we come to strategic choices, we're thinking about how might we get where we want to be, which is the best way. And today I want to introduce you to the first of 3 lectures that we'll do on strategic choices. And today I want to talk to you about how an organisation addresses the concept of how we compete. If you've read the workbook, you will see that one of the other key strategic choices questions is which businesses do we operate in? And that's what I want to move on and discuss in the next few slides. So, for an organisation thinking about strategy, it begins with asking itself, and this is an adaptation of Robert Grant's diagram from his contemporary strategy analysis textbook. So he talks about superior profitability and return on capital employed, which is a kind of measure in the commercial sector. So in order to gain competitive advantage, which leads to superior profits, we've got to answer these 2 questions. I've tailored this a little bit because, as we've seen in the sport industry, many organisations are not in the industry just for profit or for profit. They're in it for other social and sporting goals. So I've tempered that a little bit to kind of write in order to meet our objectives or our purpose, which might be profit, but which might be increasing participation, winning more medals, or improving health and social outcomes, in order to meet our objectives or purpose, we can ask a couple of questions. This week, we're going to ask the question, how should we compete? Okay, so we're going to say, in the businesses that we are currently in, or in the activities that we are currently in, how should we compete? Or how can we improve? So if we're a national governing body, or a public sector or a government organisation, rather than saying how should we compete to be better than everybody else, to achieve better profits, we might say how can we improve to actually better meet our goals, our objectives. Okay, so the variation in language is kind of is subtle, but it does reflect the nature of organisations in the sport industry. So how should we compete is really about how we gain competitive advantage, or in a more kind of public sector or NGB sense, how we secure continuous improvement to achieve superior performance. Okay, but this question about how we should compete is about business level strategy. So how should we compete is very much a kind of internally focused strategy. It's looking at what the organisation does and how it can get better at what it does. And so that is very much one which needs an understanding of the resources and the competencies that an organisation can grow and develop internally. Okay, and that's what we're going to focus on this week. Next week, or sorry, not next week, but in week 10, so in a couple of weeks, we're going to look at how an organisation addresses the question of which businesses should we be in. And we will see in a couple of weeks' time that many organisations, as they seek to pursue opportunities in the environment, as the environment develops and changes, and as they seek to kind of spread risk, they will expand into new areas of business. Okay, so this philosophy or approach to strategy is driven by understanding industry attractiveness. So which industries are attractiveness and do we think that we can succeed in? And this is corporate strategy. So this is about what areas of business do we move into, what areas of business do we move out of, and how do we move into new areas of business, and how do we move out of existing areas of business, and which areas of business should we decide to stay in. So this is very much about directions of development. So corporate strategy is about what directions should we move in, whereas business level strategy is about, well, within our current business, how should we compete? Now, if we say that competitive advantage is about an internally focused approach to strategy, or a resource-based view of strategy, which is about how do we improve internally so we can compete better, industry attractiveness suggests that you look outside your organisation to identify new business opportunities. So this is more of a kind of externally focused approach to strategy. And in reality, organisations do a bit of both. You will at least need to consider for your organisation, what businesses should we be in? Should we stay where we are? Should we move into new areas of business? Should we get out of any current areas of business? So you will think about that, but as well, you are likely to think about how can we get better in order to compete in the businesses that we're currently in. And that's what we're going to focus on today. Okay, so the aims of the session, and this is the final slide in this introduction, are that by the end of this lecture, you should have a good understanding of the meaning of business level strategy. So I've just introduced it to you as the means by which an organisation pursues its competitive strategy, how it tries to compete within the industry that it's in. I want to talk to you also about something called Michael Porter's generic strategies for competitive advantage. We did mention these briefly last week in week 7 when we talked about differentiation strategies and cost leadership strategies. And when we talked about cost leadership strategies, I briefly mentioned budget gyms and how budget gyms are a cost leadership strategy in the sport industry. And that really has come from industries like airlines, where Ryanair is a cost leader, and budget gyms have borrowed some ideas from that kind of approach to business. And differentiation, we looked at Nike and Adidas as examples of businesses which followed a differentiation strategy, which is where you try to develop high quality products with features which allow you to charge a premium price. Okay, so you should have, after this lecture, we're going to look at this in more detail. You should have a good understanding of generic strategies. What I would also hope as well is that even though we will look at specific organisations, you should be able then to think, okay, how can my organisation try to adopt some of these approaches in the way it either manages its costs to become more efficient, or the way it kind of improves the quality of its offer in order to be able to charge a premium price. And what we're going to do finally is we're going to revisit that slightly complicated framework which we looked at last week, the value chain. And we're going to look at how organisations can use the value chain as a vehicle for managing generic strategy and strategic activities. So we're going to say, how can understanding the separate activities that a business or an organisation must complete in order to produce its goods or services, how by looking at that can we understand how an organisation can either reduce costs and become more efficient at each stage, or improve the quality and the innovation of what it does in order to be able to charge a premium price. So those are the aims of the session, and what we're going to do in the next short screencast is just revisit another concept which I mentioned briefly last week, which is the 4 building blocks of competitive advantage. So we're going to look at the role of the value chain and the 4 building blocks of competitive advantage in the way an organisation can develop and deploy its business level strategy.